let's look at the running backs. Now, this week, still, it's Rico Dowdle, who last week had 206. Now he's got the number 2 spot with this past week with his 183. Welcome to Just the Stats NFL, the show that covers the all-time greats as well as the current players leading the NFL. So in this episode, we're going to look at the stats from this last week's games, week 6. We're going to look at primarily the quarterbacks and running backs. I think that's probably as far as I'll get, and then I'll do another podcast for the rest of the stats I want to look at. Receivers, some defensive stats, and a couple other stats included. So we'll look at quarterbacks and running backs primarily in this episode. Man, I can't wait to get also to the standings tomorrow. I'll probably do that. What a flip-flop. What a crazy week. Some teams that lost, you did not expect them to lose. And then teams that are winning, you didn't expect to continue to be winning. So it's going to be interesting to look at the standings and where they are at this point in time. But for now, we're going to look at some of the numbers this week in the NFL. All right, we'll start with the quarterbacks, and we'll start with the passing yards. Mac Jones led the NFL in passing yards this last week in week 6 with 347 yards. There was only 2 quarterbacks that threw for over 300 yards. Mac Jones and Jacoby Brissett, 2 backup quarterbacks, the only ones that threw for 300 yards, and both of them were in a loss. So I guess that says something about the value of throwing for over 300 yards necessarily. For Mac Jones, 347 yards, 0 TDs, but 2 interceptions, sacked 6 times. So with a quarterback rating of 75.5. So really a lot of yards, just playing catch up the whole game against the Buccaneers, never worked out. Now, Jacoby Brissett in a tight game in a loss, 31-27 to the Colts, he threw for 320. Those are your top 2. Sam Darnold in a win, the top quarterback with winning, who won a game with 295 yards. And then Jalen Hurts, 283. And then it's a kind of a big drop-off. I mean, Patrick Mahomes wrapped up the number 10 spot with only 257 yards. Pretty weak. Looking at, some of these quarterbacks, Baltimore had 2 quarterbacks in there. Cooper Rush, Tyler Huntley, both rang up the bottom of the list, 68 and 72 yards. So not much there. All right. Let's look at passing TDs this past week. Well, despite the fact that there are not a lot of yards thrown, there were a lot of TDs thrown. 5 quarterbacks threw 3 touchdowns in their game. Dak Prescott for Dallas, even though that wasn't a loss. Drake May had 3 against the Saints in a win. Patrick Mahomes had 3 in a win against Detroit. That was a little bit of an upset. I know it'd be a tough game, but still, Detroit had looked pretty good. Jaden Daniels had 3 in a loss right at the end of the game there. They lost that game right at the end. And then Bryce Young, 3 touchdown passes in a Carolina win over Dallas. Big win for Carolina. And then you had quite a few players with 2. So too many to even go through. All right, let's look at interceptions. Well, Tua Tagovailoa had 3. Now, one of them was at the very end of the game with 5 seconds to go. They were losing. They needed to at least get a field goal, and he threw the pass. It was immediately intercepted, game over. So he had 3 interceptions. And then Mac Jones in a loss had 2. Obviously, the top 5 players all had a loss, but like I said, Mac Jones in a loss to Tampa Bay had 2. And then Josh Allen had 2 last night against Atlanta. And when they lost that game, another surprising loss for the Buffalo Bills, 24-14 to the Falcons. We'll talk about some of those standings tomorrow. All right. Now, when it comes to sacks, wow, Justin Fields, he was horrible, just horrible. 9 times he was sacked. He threw for 45 yards, 9 for 17. He was constantly harassed. He just cannot let go of the ball. He stands and then he'll run around, but it's too late. I mean, Denver's too good defense. He's got to just let go of the ball. I don't anything, but he got sacked 9 times. Had a quarterback rating of 58.7, which is horrendous. Trevor Lawrence, another one, stood around way too many times, waiting, and we sacked 7 times in that game. I mean, had better stats. He had a quarterback rating of 97.1, but still, you cannot just stand back there and wait, which is what he did. Mac Jones and his loss. I tell you, the top 8 players in this list all lost their game. So being sacked seems to be a key, even when they're only sacked 3 times. Mac Jones and Cam Ward both sacked 6 times. Cam Ward had a rough game, fumbled twice as well. And then also sacked 6 times was Dillon Gabriel. So you have most of these are backups or rookies, except for Trevor Lawrence. Justin Fields is neither, but he's also been somebody who hasn't played a lot. He's been all over the place. Trevor Lawrence is the one in this list who should basically have a better grasp of his offense too. I know it's a new offense, but really needs to pick up his play if the Jaguars plan on going any farther this year. And then Josh Allen and Tyler Huntley both sacked 4 times. Now, Josh Allen's another one that sacked more times than he usually is. He only had a quarterback rating of 72.6, so rough game for him. Threw for 180 yards, 2 touchdowns, but 2 interceptions. And then Tyler Huntley, he's a backup, so, 4 sacks there. And then you had several players with 3 times that they were sacked. All right, let's look at the running backs here. Now, this is just for week 6 we're looking at right now. Now, for the running backs, wow. Rico Dowdle, another big week, led the NFL again. He had 183 yards in their win over Dallas. Good game for him, being that the Dallas Cowboys didn't want to sign him. I guess they didn't want to pay the money. Whatever the reason is, he had a nice revenge game against the Dallas Cowboys. Panthers winning that game 30-27. 183 yards on 30 carries. He had to get out of the game a couple times late in the game to kind of get his legs rubbed down. He was really working hard. He had a 6.1 yard average, so good game. And then Bijan Robinson, 170 yards against the Buffalo Bills and that Atlanta Falcons win over the Bills. He averaged 8.9 yards per carry. He had and this is helped by the fact that one of his carries was 81 yards. He only rushed the ball 19 times. But the Falcons had the Bills' number in that game. Then there's a huge drop-off from those 2 players down to Devon Achane for the Dolphins in a loss. He only had 128, not only. He had 128 yards on 16 carries, but it's a big drop from Robinson, who had 170, down to 128. And then filling in for the Chargers, Kamani Vidal had 124 yards on 18 carries. So he had a big game filling in for the injured Hampton. Jonathan Taylor, another game over 100 yards, 123 for him on 21 carries. Vidal and Taylor both wins. They both had wins in their games. Now, Derrick Henry finally had a decent game. Rushing, they tried to make more of an effort. 24 carries for 122 yards, averaged over 5 yards a carry, but it was still no good. It was a loss, 17-3 to the Rams. And then DeAndre Swift had a good game. The last player with more than 100 yards rushing, he had 108 against the Commanders in their Chicago's win over the Commanders. Like I said, that he also had some good receptions as well. A couple of receptions Swift did, and in the Bears win over the Commanders. And then rounding it out, Josh Jacobs had 93 yards in their win Green Bay's win over the Bengals. And James Cook in the loss to the Falcons, he had 87 yards. So those are your top 10. Like I said, 7 players with more than 100 yards. And when we're looking at rushing touchdowns, Cam Scatterbo in their win over the Eagles had 3 touchdowns rushing. Good game for him. 2 players, Devon Achane, in their loss, unfortunately, he had 2 touchdowns rushing, and then Josh Jacobs had 2 touchdowns, and then there was quite a few running backs that had 1 rushing touchdown. All right, let's look at, I want to look at the quarterbacks now. Let's look at the rushing yards for quarterbacks in this past week. All right, get to the quarterbacks here. Now, there was nobody that really stood out except Jackson Dart did have 58 yards rushing in their win, like I said, over the Eagles. Big game for the Giants. And that was the leading quarterback as far as rushing yards go. He's been impressive. Him and Scatterbo are making quite a pair there. Now, Jaden Daniels in that loss to the Bears had 52 rushing yards. Josh Allen in a loss had 42. Tyler Huntley filling in, he had 39. And then Patrick Mahomes, another quarterback who actually won his game, had 32. Not much from the rushing yards. Daniel Jones wrapped up the top 10 with only 20 yards. Him and Spencer Rattler had 20 yards apiece. So only a couple players over 50 yards as far as running quarterbacks go. All right, let's look at the current season now. So this isn't just week 6. This is the leaders so far this entire season. Continues to be Russell Wilson. He's put up a number that's going to be hard to beat, despite the fact that it was a loss in week 2. He had 450 yards. That's the biggest number this season. Josh Allen, no one else is over 400. Josh Allen in week 1 had 394 in that incredible 41-40 win over the Ravens. 81 points scored in that game. He had 394 yards. Matthew Stafford had 389. So this week, when you're just looking at this week, Mac Jones actually cracked the top 10 as far as passing yards with 347. He made it 9th on most passing yards this season with 347. Like I said, there was only 2 quarterbacks that even threw for over 300 yards. Already, Mac Jones, in his couple of games that he's played, his last 2 games, he's had 342, and then last week, 347. One was a win, one was a loss. So he's had quite a pair of games. So has Matthew Stafford. He's got 2 games over 375 in one and 389 in the other. So he's had 2 big games. They're the only 2 quarterbacks on this list more than one time. All right. Let's look at passing touchdowns this season. Well, still Jared Goff had 5 in week 2 in their win over the Bears, 52-21. They just crushed them, which makes you think the Lions had kind of got their act together after that week 1 loss to the Packers. And then Kansas City beats them. It's interesting. Kansas City loses on Monday night to the Jaguars and then comes back and handily beats the Lions. So Aaron Rodgers, there's quite a few quarterbacks now with 4. Aaron Rodgers, Dak Prescott, Patrick Mahomes, Sam Darnold, Lamar Jackson, C.J. Stroud, and Caleb Williams have all had 4 touchdowns. No quarterback this week, in week 6, was able to crack the top 10. Now, looking at interceptions, there's been 6 quarterbacks that have had 3 interceptions. Tua Tagovailoa made it into the top 6 this week with his 3 interceptions that he had against the Chargers in their loss 29-27. So he's the only one from this past week to make it in the top 10. And I say top 6 because there's so many that have 2. Probably somebody did make it this week, but I'm only counting the top 6 because they've had 3. And then looking at sacks for this season, well, Justin Fields was able to make it all the way to number 1 this week with his 9 times being sacked. And Trevor Lawrence tied Lamar Jackson for second with 7. So those two made it this week. Were able to take the top 2 spots, which is not a category you want to be in. Mac Jones with his 6 sacks also made it into the number 7 spot. Really a rough week for quarterbacks. And then Cam Ward also had 6. So you had 4 quarterbacks that were able to, this week, that were able to make it in the top 10 for the entire season so far as sacks goes. Not a category that you want to be in. All right. Let's look at the running backs. Now this week, still, it's Rico Dowdle, who last week had 206. Now he's got the number 2 spot with this past week with his 183. So Rico Dowdle, who only got this start because Hubbard got hurt, has racked up the top 2 rushing numbers this season. Pretty impressive. And then Bijan Robinson last night against the Bills had 170 yards, which puts him number 3 this season. So that's interesting. The top 2 of the top 3 spots were just this past week. So big rushing games there. Those are the only 2 that made it into the top 10, but they did it with quite impressive numbers. Now rushing TDs, there's still only 3 players. Cam Scatterbo was able to tie Jonathan Taylor with 3 touchdowns in a single game. Jonathan Taylor's done it twice, and now Cam Scatterbo did it just this past week against the Eagles. Then there's quite a few again with 2. So those are your leading running backs. All right. Now, just looking at quarterbacks this season, but this is the last category here. Justin Fields leads the NFL as far as quarterbacks in rushing yards with 81. He did that in week 4. He really looked bad this past week. Lamar Jackson had 70 in week 1, as did Jaden Daniels, had 68 in week 1. So those are your top 3. Patrick Mahomes, 66. He did that in week 2. No quarterback was able. Well, Jackson Dart tied for number 10 this past week with 58 yards. So he made it into the top 10 as a tie. Only quarterback from this past week to rush for enough yards to make it into the top 10. So far, no quarterback has rushed for 100 yards. All right, so that's a look at top quarterbacks, running backs. Next up, in my next podcast, I'll look at the receivers, and I'll look at a bunch of other odds and ends stats as well, defensive, field goals, different things that are interesting. All right, well, that's a wrap. I'm going to keep this short, try to make it so you can listen to it and not have to take a break. So appreciate it if you would catch me on YouTube at Just the Stats NFL. You can like and subscribe there. You can also find me on podcast apps, Apple, Spotify, whatever app you might use to do podcasts. And like I said, I'll do a part 2 for this right after I do this one and just kind of break it up that way. And then we'll look at the standings in another podcast. So I appreciate you listening. And so that is a wrap for this episode. And I'm out.